Right now, while you are listening to this, something is happening inside the architecture of your mind that you have never been told about. Right now, in this precise moment, a door is either opening or closing inside you, and most people never even notice the sound of the hinges. They wake up tomorrow in the same room they woke up in yesterday, and the day before that, and the decade before that, and they call it life. They call it normal. They call it fine. But you are here, and that means something. Why do those who try hardest fall the furthest? Aver, let me ask you that again. Because it is the question that haunted Napoleon Hill for more than 20 years as he walked through the mansions of the wealthiest men in America and then walked back out into streets where good, hardworking, desperate people were breaking themselves apart trying to survive. Why do those who try the hardest fall the furthest? Hold that question. Do not answer it yet. Let it sit in the basement of your mind. Because by the time this conversation is over, that question will have changed the entire foundation of the way you see yourself, your money, and your future. There is a grief in mediocrity that nobody talks about. It is not the loud grief of catastrophe. It is a low, dry, late afternoon sadness, the kind that settles into the chest of a person who is 43 years old, sitting at a kitchen table made of pressboard veneer, looking at a stack of bills printed on pale yellow paper and realizing that the distance between where they are and where they dreamed they would be is no longer a gap they can pretend is temporary. That grief has a texture. It feels like the rough edge of a cheap envelope. It smells like burnt coffee that nobody bothered to throw away. And it whispers the cruelest a human being can believe, that this is simply how things are. It is not how things are. It is how things were programmed. Napoleon Hill spent the better part of a lifetime studying the difference between people who built empires and people who built regrets. And what he found was not what anyone expected. It was not intelligence. It was not talent. It was not even relentless effort, though effort matters. What separated Andrew Carnegie from the man digging coal beside him was something far more invisible, far more architectural, far more deeply buried in the structure of the mind itself. And that is exactly what we are going to excavate it today. Bueno, before we go any further, if what you are hearing right now is beginning to move something inside you, if some older, quieter part of you is leaning forward because it recognizes a truth it has been waiting, here, then do this one thing. Subscribe to this channel, not because it is a formality, not because it is what people say at the beginning of videos, but because what you are about to receive across this conversation and every conversation that follows on this channel is the kind of compressed, rara, life-altering knowledge that Napoleon Hill spent decades assembling by sitting in rooms with the most powerful minds in industrial history. Carnegie, Ford, Edison, Rockefeller, the men who built the bones of modern civilization. Subscribe, because you are clearly someone who is serious about building something real. And leave a comment below right now. Tell me, what is the one wall inside your mind that has kept you from the wealth you know you deserve? Write it down, because naming a wall is the first step toward tearing it down. Now, let us talk about the room most people are living in. Pues picture this. It is an ordinary Tuesday morning, the kind of Tuesday that looks like every other Tuesday, gray and indifferent and slightly too cold. A man, we will call him Thomas, sets his alarm for 5:45 in the morning. He has been setting it for 5:45 for 11 years. He drives 40 minutes on a highway that smells like exhaust and wet asphalt. He works for a company whose name he would not mention at a dinner party because even saying it out loud feels like a small defeat. He works hard. He works very hard. He skips lunch sometimes. He stays late when his supervisor asks, and sometimes when nobody asks. He drives home in the dark, and he sits beside his wife on a sofa whose cushions are beginning to collapse in the middle. And they watch TV and they do not talk about money, because talking about money in that house is like pressing on a bruise. Thomas is not lazy. Thomas is not stupid. Thomas is not unlucky in the cosmic sense of the word. Thomas is simply living in a room with no windows and no blueprint, following instructions that were handed to him by people who were themselves following instructions handed to them by people who never questioned the room either. This is the tragedy Napoleon Hill saw everywhere. Not evil, not Melissa, not bad luck. Just a room with no map to the door. And here's what makes that tragedy sharp enough to cut. The door was never locked. It was always there, right there inside the architecture of Thomas's own mind. Behind a wall that had been plastered over with fear and habit and the dull acceptance of the ordinary. The door was always there, but Thomas never learned to see it. Now, here is where the conversation has to become uncomfortable. Because Napoleon Hill was not a gentle man when it came to the cost of inaction. He was precise about it. He was almost surgical. And if you are sitting with the comfortable idea that things will naturally improve, that the economy will shift in your favor, that the right moment is just around the corner, that you will start tomorrow, then what follows in this conversation is specifically and urgently for you. Dejen pensar un momento, because this next part needs to land correctly. The danger is not poverty itself. The danger is inherited poverty. The danger is the specific devastating mechanism by which one person's unexamined fear becomes the ceiling of the next generation. Napoleon Hill understood this with a depth that went far beyond economics. He understood it psychologically, architecturally, almost spiritually. When a parent lives in a mental room built on scarcity, that room does not stay private. It becomes the first home a child knows. It becomes the smell of what is normal. The walls of that room become the walls the child assumes are the outer limits of the world. Think about what that means. Think about your children, or the children you will have, or the children of someone you love. Think about a 7-year-old girl with dark eyes and a notebook full of drawings of things she wants to build someday. Now think about what happens to the walls of her imagination when every conversation she overhears at the kitchen table is about what cannot be afforded, what is too expensive, what is not for people like us. Think about what happens to the architecture of her ambition when the foundational message of her childhood home is wanting more is dangerous. Dreaming big is foolish. Money is something that other people have. That 7-year-old girl becomes a woman who apologizes for her own desires. And her children inherit those same apologetic walls. This is not abstract. This is not philosophical speculation. This is the precise mechanism through which financial limitation replicates itself across generations. And Napoleon Hill documented it with the obsessive care of a man who refused to let it remain invisible. He called it the poverty consciousness, and he said it was the single most destructive force in human civilization, more damaging than any natural disaster, because natural disasters are visible and poverty consciousness is not. It hides inside the mind like a false foundation, looking solid, looking real, feeling like common sense, while it quietly undermines every room built above it. Why do those who try hardest fall the furthest? Because trying without reprogramming the foundation is like adding floors to a building whose basement is already cracked. You can work yourself to exhaustion. You can grind and sacrifice and deprive yourself of sleep and joy and presence and still find yourself, at 50, looking at the same yellow bills, the same pressboard table, the same collapsed cushions on the same sofa, wondering what you did wrong when the honest answer is that you did almost everything right, except the one thing that matters most: you never changed the blueprint. And here is where the urgency must be stated plainly, because Napoleon Hill was never in the business of comfortable half-truths. Espera, really sit with this. The window is not infinite. The runway of your life does not extend forever into a clean, open horizon. You are moving through time right now, in this moment, while these words are reaching you, and the years do not slow down for the undecided. The man who says he will start building his wealth consciousness next year is the same man who said it the year before, and the year before that, and who will say it again next year, and who will one day find himself at the end of a life he mostly postponed, lying in a bed in a room he could not afford to make beautiful, holding the cold and specific regret of a person who had the seed of something magnificent in his hand and chose, year after year after year, to keep it in his pocket rather than plant it. Napoleon Hill interviewed men who had built fortunes and men who had squandered them and men who had never built them at all. And the men who carried the heaviest weight were not the ones who tried and failed. The men who carried the heaviest weight were the ones who never fully tried, who stayed half committed, half believing, half present in their own ambition because the fear of failure felt safer than the risk of full investment. Those men, he wrote, do not just die with their music unplayed. They die knowing it. They die hearing it. They die in the silence of what they did not do. And that silence is not peaceful. It is not peaceful at all. Now, if you are still here, and you are, because something in you refused to look away, then something important is already happening in the architecture of your mind. A door is beginning to crack open. Not fully yet, but enough to let in a thread of light. And that thread of light is exactly what we need to work with. Because Napoleon Hill's greatest discovery was not a strategy or a tactic or a 5-step formula. His greatest discovery was that the mind of a person who is about to receive wealth behaves differently from the mind of a person who is not, and that these behavioral differences appear as signs, as measurable, observable internal signs that can be recognized, cultivated, and deliberately amplified. Aware. This is where everything shifts. Before wealth arrives, there are sign-specific ones. Not mystical omens, not vague feelings of positivity, but concrete, identifiable changes in the way a mind operates, in the way a person relates to their own desires, in the way they begin to move through the architecture of their daily existence. And Napoleon Hill, across decades of research and interviews and the relentless testing of his own principles, cataloged these signs with extraordinary precision. Let us begin with the first one, because it is also the most misunderstood. The mind begins to feel a burning discomfort with its current room. Not a casual dissatisfaction, not the low, dry, late afternoon sadness we mentioned earlier, though that sadness is often where it begins. No, this is something sharper. This is the feeling of a person who has suddenly, perhaps for the first time, truly registered the ceiling above them and felt it as an insult to their potential. Napoleon Hill called this the arousal of desire, and he was extremely specific that desire of this quality is not the same as wishing, not the same as hoping, not the same as the vague yearning that most people carry, like a pebble in their shoe for decades without ever stopping to remove it. This desire is hot. It has a physical texture, like the warmth of a wooden handle on a tool you have just decided to pick up and use. It is focused. It has a specific number attached to it, a specific vision, a specific outcome that the mind begins to hold with the same automatic constancy with which the lungs hold air. If you are feeling something like that right now, if the discomfort of your current room is beginning to feel less like a familiar ache and more like an urgent, undeniable demand for change, that is the first sign. Do not quiet it. Do not manage it back down to something comfortable. Let it burn. Napoleon Hill said that the man who waters down his desire to avoid the discomfort of wanting too much has already chosen his ceiling. The second sign is subtler, and it requires a kind of honest self-observation that most people actively avoid. The mind begins to take possession of its own thoughts. Bueno, let me explain what that means, because it sounds simple, and it is anything, but most people experience their thoughts, the way they experience weather, as something that happens to them from outside, unpredictable and uncontrollable, and largely beyond their influence. They wake up in the morning and whatever the mind serves them. Fear about money, anxiety about the future, the replayed memory of a past failure. They consume it without question. They do not examine its origin. They do not interrogate its accuracy. They simply accept it as reality, and then wonder why their reality keeps confirming it. Napoleon Hill called this the untended garden of the subconscious mind, and he pointed out, with a precision that was ahead of its time, that the subconscious mind does not distinguish between a real experience and a vividly imagined one. It simply processes what it is given and then works with extraordinary diligence to manufacture more of the same. If you give it fear, it builds a room made of fear and then works tirelessly to keep you inside it. If you give it scarcity, it constructs a basement full of scarcity and makes sure you can feel its cold weight through every floor above. But here is the turn. And this is where the science of the mind that Hill was describing decades before modern neuroscience caught up with him becomes genuinely extraordinary. The opposite is equally true. If you give the subconscious mind a clear, specific, emotionally charged image of abundance, of the exact life you intend to build, of the precise financial freedom you intend to claim, it does not question it. It does not argue with it. It simply begins to work toward it with the same diligence, the same architectural precision, the same relentless forward motion. This is the technique Napoleon Hill called autosuggestion, and it is not, let us be clear, the pastel-colored affirmation poster version of the concept that has been diluted to near uselessness in popular culture. This is something far more muscular. This is the deliberate, repeated, emotionally saturated introduction of a specific idea into the subconscious mind through the doorway of concentrated attention. It requires sitting down, physically sitting down in a quiet room, preferably at the same time each day, and reading aloud to yourself a written statement of your chief definite aim, your specific financial target, precise date by which you intend to claim it, and the specific service you intend to provide in exchange for it. Reading it aloud with feeling. Not reciting it flatly like a grocery list, but speaking it with the full weight of your conviction, your desire, your absolute refusal to accept anything less. Hill said that the subconscious mind is moved by emotion far more readily than by cold logic. He said that faith, which he defined not as religious belief, but as the absolute certainty of the mind that a specific outcome is inevitable, is the most powerful accelerant you can apply to the process of wealth creation. And he said that faith of this quality is not a gift that some people have and others do not. It is a habit. It is a practice. It is the result of daily, consistent, emotionally charged communication between the conscious mind and the subconscious mind, until the subconscious mind no longer considers the desired outcome a wish but a fact waiting to be physically realized. Ahora bien, the sign that this is beginning to work is specific. You will notice that your spontaneous thoughts begin to shift, not immediately, Not dramatically at first, but with the steady, almost architectural patience of a foundation being poured. You will begin to notice opportunities you were walking past before. You will begin to encounter people who seem, almost mysteriously, to be aligned with the direction you have set. You will find that ideas arrive with an almost uncomfortable frequency. Ideas about how to generate income, how to solve problems that others are willing to pay to have solved, how to build something that compounds over time. This is not coincidence. This is the subconscious mind, now oriented toward a specific target, doing what it was always capable of doing, scanning the environment with extraordinary thoroughness and surfacing information relevant to the mission you have assigned it. Why do those who try hardest fall the furthest? Because they work on the floors of the building without ever examining the foundation. They pour energy into action while the subconscious mind is still quietly, reliably manufacturing the same old room. The third sign is one that Napoleon Hill documented with particular care, because it is the sign that most directly separates those who eventually arrive at wealth from those who remain perpetually close to it without ever crossing the threshold. The person beginning to approach wealth becomes intolerant of their own excuses. Dehem pensarum momento, because this one cuts. Every person who has ever remained in financial mediocrity has a collection of reasons. They are not bad reasons. They are often very good reasons. The economy is unfair. The system is rigged. The timing was wrong. There was a health crisis, a family crisis, a period of bad luck, a run of circumstances that genuinely were outside their control. Napoleon Hill did not dismiss these realities. He was not naive about the obstacles that life constructs. But he made a distinction, a surgical, unsparing distinction between acknowledging a circumstance and granting it permanent authority over your future. He said that every man who ever built something extraordinary began in a room full of obstacles. Carnegie began in poverty so severe that the concept of poverty barely does it justice. He arrived in America as a child with nothing, not a dollar, not a connection, not a safety net of any kind. Edison failed so many times and in such public, documented ways that lesser men would have accepted the evidence as a verdict. Ford was told by experts, by colleagues, by financiers, by people who were genuinely trying to help him that his vision was not viable. What made these men different was not the absence of obstacles. What made them different was the refusal to allow the obstacle to become the story. The person who is beginning to approach wealth stops telling the story of what stopped them and starts telling the story of what they are building. This is not naive optimism. This is a precise psychological repositioning of the mind's attention from the walls that surround it to the door that leads through them. And this repositioning has real measurable effects on behavior, on the decisions a person makes, on the risks they are willing to take, on the relationships they seek, on the hours they invest, on the quality of focus they bring to every action that moves them toward their aim. Now, let us talk about one of the most powerful forces Napoleon Hill ever documented, and one of the most underused, the mastermind, pues this concept is so foundational to Hill's entire philosophy of wealth creation that it is almost impossible to overstate its importance. And yet it is the principle most often reduced to a vague platitude and then set aside. The mastermind, as Hill defined it, is not simply the idea of networking or surrounding yourself with successful people. Though those elements are present, the mastermind is something far more precise. It is the deliberate formation of a group of two or more minds, working together in perfect harmony toward a specific, defined objective, with each member contributing not just their knowledge and skills, but the full energy of their aligned mental focus. Hill said that when two minds come together in this way, a third mind is created, an invisible, enormously powerful force that is greater than the sum of the individual minds involved. He had observed this phenomenon in the partnerships of the greatest industrialists of his era. Carnegie himself attributed his entire fortune not to his own mind alone, but to the mastermind alliance he had constructed and maintained around himself with deliberate, almost architectural care. He surrounded himself with people who were not yes-men, not admirers, not simply competent employees, but genuine intellectual and emotional partners who challenged him, who brought perspectives his own mind could not generate alone, who filled the rooms of his thinking with light he could not produce independently. This is not a metaphor. This is a practical instruction. If you are building wealth alone, sealed inside the private room of your own thinking, working in isolation because you have not yet found the right people, or because you are afraid of sharing your vision, or because the people around you have never believed in large things, and you have quietly absorbed their skepticism, then you are attempting to construct an empire with one hand. It is possible. People have done it, but it is slower, harder, and infinitely more prone to the kind of invisible ceiling that stops a person just short of breakthrough. The practical instruction is this. Identify the specific area of expertise and perspective that your vision requires and that your own mind cannot supply. Then find the person who holds it. Not casually, not eventually. Now, reach out, propose an alliance. Be specific about what you are building and why. Be honest about what you bring and what you need. Napoleon Hill was emphatic that the universe rewards the bold. Specific, ask far more generously than it rewards the vague, timid wish. Here is a question that needs to land with its full weight. Who is in the room with you right now? Not physically, but mentally. Whose voice is inside the architecture of your daily thinking? Because the voices you allow into that architecture become part of the foundation. If the voices are voices of limitation, of comfortable smallness, of fear dressed up as practicality, then you're building on a compromised foundation no matter how excellent your blueprints. Napoleon Hill spent time with Andrew Carnegie not because Carnegie was kind or charming or easy to be around. Though he may have been some of those things, he spent time with Carnegie because Carnegie's mind operated at a frequency that Hill had never encountered before, and that frequency was contagious. It altered the architecture of Hill's own thinking simply through sustained exposure. This is the mechanism behind the mastermind principle. The minds you inhabit change the mind you inhabit. Choose accordingly. Now, let us return to Thomas, the man at the pressboard table with the pile of yellow bills, because Thomas is not a fixed character. Thomas is a possibility. Thomas is, in fact, a story that Napoleon Hill would have recognized instantly, because he heard versions of it from nearly every man who eventually broke through to extraordinary wealth. The story before the turning point. The story of the room with no windows and no map to the door. Thomas, in this version of the story, reaches a night that is different from the other nights. Not because anything dramatic happens externally. The bills are the same. The collapsed sofa cushions are the same. The TV is on. But something shifts internally. Something small and decisive, like a key turning in a lock that has been frozen for years. Thomas picks up a notebook. A real notebook. The kind with a dark green cover and thick cream-colored pages. And he writes a number. Not a wish. Not a prayer. A number. A specific dollar figure that represents not what he thinks he can have, but what he has decided he will have. He writes the date beside it. He writes 3 sentences about what he will give in return for it, because Napoleon Hill was insistent that wealth is never simply received but always exchanged for something of genuine value. And then Thomas reads those sentences aloud, alone in the kitchen with the collapsed sofa and the pale yellow bills. And something in the room changes temperature. That moment, that specific, private, slightly absurd feeling moment of a man sitting alone in a kitchen reading, a declaration to himself, that is the moment Napoleon Hill would recognize as the turning point. Not the first million, not the successful business, not the interview or the connection or the opportunity. The turning point is always internal. It is always architectural. It is always the moment when a person stops waiting for the room to change and begins, with full intention, to change the blueprint. If they could, you can. Why do those who try hardest fall the furthest? Because they never stop to change the blueprint. They add floors to a cracked foundation and wonder why the building keeps settling. But you right now, in this conversation, are holding the blueprint. And what comes next is the most practical set of instructions Napoleon Hill ever assembled. Write your chief definite aim, not a category of desire, not a general direction, a specific, numerical, dated, emotionally saturated statement of exactly what you intend to achieve, and by when and through what specific contribution of service or value to the world. Write it by hand on paper that has weight and texture. Fold it and carry it in a pocket close to your body. Read it aloud every morning upon waking, before the noise of the day colonizes the architecture of your attention. Read it aloud every night before sleep, in the quiet room of the mind's most receptive state, when the subconscious is most permeable to new instruction. Do not read it flatly. Read it with the full heat of your desire, because the subconscious mind, as Hill discovered, and as decades of subsequent science have supported, responds to emotion with far greater speed and fidelity than it responds to logic. Bueno, here is the piece that most people skip because it sounds too simple to be powerful. Do this for 30 consecutive days without missing a single day. Not 29, 30. The consistency is not arbitrary. The consistency is the mechanism. You are not simply reminding yourself of a goal. You are constructing a new room inside the architecture of your subconscious mind. And rooms are built brick by brick, day by day, with a patience that is itself a form of power. The second practical instruction is one that Napoleon Hill considered so essential that he devoted an entire chapter to it and then returned to it in every book he wrote thereafter. Control the inputs. The mind is a building, and every experience you allow through its doors becomes part of the interior. Every piece of information you consume, every conversation you engage in, every environment you choose to inhabit, every voice you give your attention to, all of these are furnishing the rooms of your subconscious. If the furnishings are scarcity, fear, gossip, complaint, and the comfortable smallness of people who have decided that the room they are in is the only room there is, then your subconscious will decorate accordingly. Napoleon Hill was ruthless about this. He was not unkind, but he was precise. He said that a man who wishes to grow wealthy must be willing to spend less time in the company of those who have made peace with poverty. Not because those people are bad or less deserving, but because their frequency is incompatible with the frequency required to build something new. This is not arrogance. This is architecture. You cannot build a room with incompatible materials. Replace a portion of your daily information diet with the biographies of men and women who built extraordinary things from nothing. Not to worship them, but to train your mind to recognize that the extraordinary is a pattern, not an accident. To internalize the evidence that the distance between where you are and where you intend to be has been crossed before by people with fewer advantages, more obstacles, and no guarantees. Let their stories furnish the rooms of your subconscious with the specific texture of what is possible. The third practical instruction is the one that most directly addresses the question we have been carrying through this entire conversation. Espera, because this one changes the foundation. Stop fighting your fear of failure. Start cultivating your fear of the alternative. Napoleon Hill observed that the men who built the greatest fortunes in industrial history were not fearless. They were afraid of exactly one thing with an intensity that made every other fear irrelevant. They were afraid of dying in the room they were born in. They were afraid of the specific soul-hollowing cost of a life not fully lived, of a potential not fully used, of a legacy not built. They were afraid, with a visceral, daily architectural clarity, of the version of themselves that would exist at 70 years old, sitting in a room furnished with regret, knowing that the door had always been there, and that they had never walked through it. That fear, properly channeled, properly focused, is not a weakness. It is the most powerful motivator available to the human mind. It is the burning desire that Hill described as the starting point of all achievement. It is the heat that melts the old blueprint and makes space for the new one. So let your fear be useful. Let it point you toward the door instead of away from it. Let it remind you, every morning when the alarm sounds and the comfortable bed argues for 5 more minutes, that the minutes are not free. That every minute spent in the old room is a minute not spent building the new one. That the pressboard table and the pale yellow bills are patient. That they will wait for you, that they will still be there if you choose them, and that the only thing preventing you from choosing something else is the decision to change the blueprint. Pues the fourth practical instruction addresses something that Napoleon Hill called specialized knowledge, and it is, in the current landscape of opportunity, perhaps more relevant than it has ever been in human history. Wealth does not reward generalized effort. Wealth rewards the precise application of specific, deep knowledge to a specific, real problem that a specific group of people urgently needs solved. This is not a new idea. Hill documented it across every major fortune he studied. Carnegie did not simply work hard in steel. He knew steel with a depth and specificity that no one around him could match, and he applied that knowledge to a specific gap in the infrastructure of a growing nation. Rockefeller did not simply work hard in oil. He understood the logistics of oil distribution with a precision that turned a commodity into a controlled system. Ford did not simply work hard in manufacturing. He understood the specific inefficiency of how things were built and invented a solution so precise that it restructured the entire physical landscape of production. The question Hill would ask you right now, and it is a question worth sitting with in the quiet room of your most honest thinking, is this: what do you know with enough depth and specificity to solve a real problem for real people? Not what you wish you knew, not what you think you should know. What do you actually know right now? From your life, your experience, your failures, your observations, that someone else would pay to access? The answer to that question is the seed of your financial freedom. And if the answer is not yet clear, that is not a reason to wait. That is a reason to begin the process of identifying it with the same focused architectural intentionality you are bringing to everything else. Hill was explicit. The search for specialized knowledge must be active, daily, and directed. Read, study, apprentice yourself, formally or informally, to people who are already doing what you intend to do. Ask better questions. Take notes on paper with a pen that has weight in the hand, because the physical act of writing embeds information in the subconscious with a fidelity that typing does not match. Avere, here is the fifth instruction, and it is perhaps the most counterintuitive of all. Decide before you are ready. Napoleon Hill was fascinated by the speed of decision-making among the wealthiest men he studied. He found, without exception, that men of great wealth made decisions quickly and changed them slowly. Men of poverty and mediocrity made decisions slowly and changed them quickly. The pattern was so consistent across every case he studied that he elevated it to a principle. One of the core principles of Think and Grow Rich. Decisiveness is not a personality trait. It is a practiced mental discipline, and it is directly connected to the strength of the chief definite aim. A person who has written down a specific emotionally charged financial target and has been reading it aloud every day for 30 days does not agonize over decisions that move them toward that target. The target acts as a compass, and the compass makes the direction clear. The decision becomes almost automatic because the subconscious mind, now oriented toward the specific outcome, evaluates every option against that orientation and surfaces the answer with a speed that people who have not done the foundational work experience as mysterious intuition. It is not mysterious, it is architecture. It is what happens when the foundation is sound. Dejam pensar un momento on this last point, because it needs to be stated with the full weight it deserves. The legacy you are building or failing to build does not belong only to you. It belongs to every person who will come after you. It belongs to the children who will grow up inside the architecture of your financial life, who will absorb its ceilings as their own, who will build their own ambitions on the foundation you lay or fail to lay. It belongs to the partner who chose you and who deserves to live in a home, whose walls are built on abundance and intention, rather than scarcity and apology. It belongs to the generation after that, the grandchildren who will never know your name, but who will live inside the consequences of your decisions. Napoleon Hill understood this with a depth that went beyond business. He understood that wealth is not a private achievement. It is a public act. It is the construction of a building that others will inhabit long after the builder is gone. And the quality of that construction, the soundness of its foundation, the height of its rooms, the light that comes through its windows, these things are determined not by luck or timing, or the generosity of circumstance, but by the clarity of the blueprint, the heat of the desire, the consistency of the daily practice, and the absolute, uncompromising refusal to accept the old room as the final room. Why do those who try hardest fall the furthest? Because they tried without changing the blueprint, because they poured effort into a cracked foundation and called the settling of the building bad luck, because they never sat alone in a quiet room and read aloud to themselves a declaration of what they intended to build and why. Because they never found the door in the wall that was always there, waiting, patient, exactly where the fear was loudest. That is the answer. And the answer is also the instruction. Change the blueprint, write the number, read it aloud. Find the people whose minds will expand yours. Identify the knowledge that is already inside you waiting to be applied. Decide it before you are ready. And let the fear of the alternative, the fear of the pressboard table, and the pale yellow bills, and the collapsed sofa cushions, and the late afternoon grief of a life not fully lived, let that fear be the fuel that keep the fire burning. The signs of wealth approaching are not dramatic. They are quiet and internal and architectural. They are the warmth of a desire that refuses to be managed back down to something comfortable. They are the beginning of a new voice inside the mind, a voice that sounds like your own but has a frequency you have not heard before. The frequency of a person who has decided with full intention and zero apology to walk through the door. That voice is speaking right now. The only question is whether you are listening. And if you are, if something in this conversation has moved something in the architecture of your thinking, then do not let this moment be the moment you almost changed the blueprint. Let it be the moment you did. Right now, before the day reassembles itself around you, before the noise returns and the familiar walls close in again, write the number. Write the date. Write the 3 sentences about what you will give in return, and then read them aloud. Because the person who does that, the person who takes that one small, slightly absurd, enormously powerful action in the next 10 minutes, that person has already crossed the threshold. That person is already in the most foundational and architectural sense of the word. Wealthy, not yet in the bank, not yet in the house or the car or the freedom, but in the one place that matters first, in the blueprint, in the foundation, in the subconscious mind that will now work day and night. With the same diligence it once used to keep you in the old room, to build the new one, the door was always there, and you have always had the key.